Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 14th common session of Sunoikis Digital Classics Summer Semester 2019. Today, we have a session about the Scaife viewer, the new reading environment of the Perseus project, and our guest is James Tauber. James has been contributing to Sunoikisis in the past. He already presented in different sessions, and today, again, he's with us. So James Tauber is, the founder of Eldarium, which develops different complex web applications for different projects in education and digital humanities. James is a digital philologist, if I can say that. He has many different interests in the digital humanities, including linguistics and ancient Greek, modeling music, digital talking also, open source, and many other really projects. And as part of his research interest, he has been also developing the Scaife viewer, the new reading environment of the Perseus Digital Library. And today he's going to present the Scaife viewer. You have the class outline in GitHub with the description of this session, YouTube link, other links, and then we will also add the slides. So James, welcome back to Sunoikisis. Thank you again for contributing to our program.
Thank you very much, Monica, and hello everyone. Thanks for listening, whether it's live or you're watching the video later on. I hope you get a lot out of this talk. So let me just switch to my slides. I'm actually currently in the beautiful city of Leuven in Flanders, in a hotel room, but you don't need to see that or me. So I will switch to the slides and we'll get going. Okay.
Okay, perfect. We can.
Excellent.
Slides. Yes.
Okay, so as Monica mentioned, I am the founder of a company called Eldarium, but I also, as well as working as a professional software developer, also do a fair bit of digital philology myself. And so this has been an absolutely wonderful project to work on the last 2 years because it really combines both of those facets of my life. Just to quickly get out of the way, you can follow me on Twitter at @jtauber and find out a little bit more about some of my scholarly interests, particularly relating to Greek, at jktauber.com. But let's get started. So I want to start off talking a little bit about the history and motivation for Scaife, what it is and how it came about. I'll give a bit of a tour of the various functionality that it has for the Perseus Digital Library. And then once I've shown you the user interface and various features that it has, I'll take a step back and look at some of the sort of guts of how it works, particularly what the pipeline is to get texts into the Scaife viewer, and sort of some of the technologies that involves, including CTS and the Capitans suite. And then after we've sort of talked about how it currently works, I'll shift gears a little bit to talk about the way that Scaife is starting to be used beyond just the Perseus Digital Library. Because one of the exciting things that's happened in the last year or so is that more digital humanities projects are interested in using the Scaife viewer for their information. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and then talk about some of the new ideas, new concepts, new architecture that is emerging out of some of the new requirements that we have because of those new projects. And then finally, I'll finish up by talking a little bit about how you can get involved if you're interested as a developer, or working on some particular project that needs a reading environment, how you can get involved with the Scaife viewer ecosystem and community. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about how this started. Most of you are probably aware of the Perseus Digital Library, which for many decades has really led the sort of open text movement not just within classics, but more broadly in providing texts in an open fashion in an online reading environment. Although, I mean, Perseus predates the web. Perseus is so old that for many of you may not be able to imagine what the world was like before the World Wide Web, but Perseus existed. It was then delivered on CD-ROM and then eventually on the web. And the last big iteration of that, of the web interface, happened about 15 years ago, what was called version 4 or Hopper of the Perseus Digital Library. And even though most of that work on that interface was done 15 years ago, a lot of continuing work happened focused on expanding the range of texts that were available. And a series of new projects emerged, things like the first 1K of Greek project as part of the Open Greek and Latin project to make more texts available. And so a lot of work was done in preparing texts to be available in the reading environment. But the challenge was essentially twofold with the existing code. One was that it really was not as easy as people wanted for to add new features and to get people contributing to the code base. But secondly, it was difficult to add new texts. And so the goal of this next version of the Perseus Digital Library, and in particular, the new online reading environment for Perseus 5, if you like, had two goals. One, to make it much easier to add new texts, and secondly, to have a more open and extensible platform so that others could contribute and others could use it for projects beyond the Perseus Digital Library. And so the result of that, those goals was the Scaife viewer, which was developed last year. Well, work started towards the end of 2017, and the Scaife viewer was launched on March 15th, 2018. Overall, as part of the Open Greek and Latin project, the funding for the initial development was from the Alexander von Humboldt Chair of Digital Humanities at the University of Leipzig. It was developed by my company, Eldarian, and then open sourced under an MIT license. So all the code is available and can be reused without any restriction on what you use it for. Now, if you're not aware, the name Scaife comes from Ross Scaife, who was a real pioneer in digital classics and really promoted a spirit of openness and laid a lot of the foundation for the whole community of digital classicists working in a very open way. And very sadly, he passed away in 2008 prematurely, and it was decided that the Scaife viewer 10 years later would be named in his honor. And so that's where the name Scaife comes from, if you're wondering. Before we drill into what Scaife looks like and how it works and where it's headed in the future, I want to just say a little bit about what are the kinds of things that online readers need to be able to do in general. This is actually an exercise that we undertook right at the start. We built what's sometimes referred to as a reference model to just in a very abstract way think about the kinds of things that you need to be able to do. And the actual reference model that we built was a little bit more involved in this, but just to get you sort of thinking about the sorts of capabilities that readers may or may not have, you need to be able to decide, you need to be able to control what passage do I want to actually look at? How do I get to the thing that I want to read? So it might be browsing through a library that might be organized in a variety of different ways. You might want to access things by reference. You might want to go to a particular book and range of lines of the Iliad, for example. Or you might want to perform some sort of text search. You might be interested in a particular word or phrase and be able to get to texts that way. And then once you're looking at a passage, there's the whole question of how do you navigate around? How do I go to the next passage or the previous passage? Or how do I navigate up and down. And also there's questions about the actual display of the passage. How is it styled? What features are available in terms of the sort of styling that you can have in the text? And also, how do you make clear to the reader where they are in the text? What is it that they're looking at? What's the overall structure of the document that they're reading? And most of those things really need to be covered as a bare minimum in any online reader. But one of the goals with the Scaife viewer, in particular, as we get more and more interesting annotations on the texts that we study, was incorporating some of this other stuff as well. So there's a whole range of different things you might want to annotate texts with, and a variety of different ways that you might want to apply that annotation. So for example, if you have done some sort of part of speech tagging of the text where you've, for every single word in the text, marked up that it's, whether it's a noun or a verb or an adjective or whatever, there's lots of different ways that you could present that information in a reading environment. You could do it through styling, color coding the words. You could do it through an interlinear display. Maybe when you hover over a word, it gives you information, or when you click on a word, it presents information about that in the sidebar. These are all the sorts of possibilities that an online reading environment that supports rich annotation might actually adopt. And then there's what I've called here synchronized reading. Often when you're looking at a text, there are other things that you want to look at as well, and you want those other things to change depending on what the text you're looking at is. So it could be translations of the text. You might be reading a text in Greek or Latin, and then alongside that want to see a translation in English or German or French or whatever. You may want to see alternative editions of a text, or maybe commentaries about the text, or images, perhaps manuscript images, for example, and be able to look at those in a synchronized fashion. So you can browse manuscript images alongside the text. Now, not all of the stuff that I've just talked about is currently possible or currently available in Scaife on the Perseus Digital Library, but right from the get-go, we knew we wanted to build an architecture that would support that. And towards the end, I'll talk more about some of the new things we're doing that are really going to focus on some of those last features that I talked about. So let me now actually start to show you some of the Perseus Digital Library running with the Scaife viewer. I've actually just got screenshots here. I didn't want to chance doing a live demo with a network connection, especially as I'm in an unfamiliar place. But hopefully I'll be able to show you around the Scaife viewer if you haven't already used it, and really give you an idea of the kind of capabilities that it currently has before I move on to how it all works under the covers. So the Scaife viewer for the Perseus Digital Library is available at scaife.perseus.org, and it has a range of texts, not just in Greek and Latin, but a lot of translations of those works into English and French and German. There's also some Persian texts and some Hebrew texts and a bunch of other stuff as well. I'll come in a moment to how things get in here. It's actually quite simple as long as the texts conform to certain requirements. But just to give you a flavor here, just within, so we've got about 50 million words overall in the Perseus Digital Library and first 1K of Greek that are available in the Scaife viewer. About 20 million in Greek, 15.6 million in Latin. And that's across almost 2,000 works and over 2,000 editions or translations of those works. Now, there's really three, I guess, different parts to the Scaife viewer as it's currently implemented for the Perseus Digital Library. There's the library browsing, there's the text searching, and then there's the actual reading. And you can browse the library just by clicking on Browse Library on the homepage. You can do text searches by clicking on Text Search, or if you want to just jump straight into reading something, we've got links straight into the Iliad and Plato's Apology. But just to quickly show you, first of all, the library browsing. If you click on Browse Library, and you can always go to Browse Library and Text Search in the nav bar up here. But the way that the library is organized is into what are called text groups. And for the most part, text groups correspond to authors, or ways at least that the works are traditionally grouped by author, and then within that, works. And so what you can actually do in the text group view is start typing the name of a text group, like an author, or you can start typing the name of a work. And what will happen is that the list, here we've got a list of the text groups. You can expand any of these, like I've expanded Aeschylus here to see the various works under Aeschylus we have. But you can start typing anything, and this will be dynamically filtered based on what you're typing. So if you start typing apology, then all the various apologies will appear, whether they're Plato's or others as well. So if you just know the name of part of the work or the author, you can start typing and it will be filtered down. You can also get a flat list of the works. One of the key things in the whole Perseus digital library and the first 1K of Greek is the use of these identifiers called CTS URNs. And they are globally unique identifiers for text groups, for works, for editions of works, for passages within those editions. And I'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. But just to explain this column, this is a unique identifier that refers to the particular works or text groups in question. And if you know the CTS URN of something, regardless of what it happens to be called, what happens to be titled, you can also sort by those and navigate that way as well. And then once you can click on any of these and get a list of what editions are available within the Perseus library. You can get to a table of contents of the individual works if there's any kind of structure around it, like individual chapters or sections and so on. But you can also dive straight into being able to read. But before I go to the actual reading environment, I want to say a little bit about how the text search works from a user's perspective. So you can just start typing in words and search, but there's some more powerful capabilities in terms of not just looking for keywords, but having requirements about certain words appearing close to others, or a word appearing but not another word. And you can see this little search guide at the top. You can use a minus to negate a single token. So if you want a word, you want passages to have a particular word but not another word, you can use the minus sign to say, I don't want to show passages that can contain this word. But you can do other things like search for particular phrases or combinations of words with a little bit of fuzziness as to how far apart those words are allowed to be. So if you just search for love Socrates in quotation marks, you won't get any hits, because there's no case in this text where you have the English word love immediately followed by Socrates. But you can put this little tilde too and say, well, I don't care if they're two words apart. And this number could be anything. You could say 5 words apart or whatever. And so we actually find that Plutarch in two cases in a translation, you get love and Socrates appearing within 2 words of one another. You can also do searches, obviously not only of the English, but of whatever language the particular texts are in. And in the case of Greek, you can also do lemma searches. So you can do a search for something like phileo, which is a Greek lemma, and a variety of any form of phileo will appear. One of the other things you can do, as shown here, is rather than actually get the full instances with example text highlighted, if you just want a list of the passages, you can select passages and just get a list of the passages that contain some form of phileo. Now, in this case, what I've actually done is I did an initial search for the lemma phileo, but then it came up with all the hits for phileo. And on the left-hand side here, it actually showed me a list of all the text groups that appeared in. And I'm not showing, I skipped that step for this screenshot, but then I clicked on Plato and said, I really just want to filter down to showing me where phileo appears in Plato. And it's further showing me the works with the counts. And if I wanted to, I could filter it by work. But here's the list of the first 10 of 31 hits for phileo in the Plato text group. So that's a quick overview of the text search capability. But of course, at the end of the day, this is a reading environment. Both the library and the text search are primarily about getting you to texts. So let's talk a little bit about the actual reading environment. So imagine that back on the home page, I'd clicked on the Iliad. One of the things that we wanted to do is have a very clean reading environment that let you first and foremost just be able to see the text. And so if you just open up the Iliad, you just see the first 7 lines here and can immediately start reading. Now you'll notice on the left and the right, there are these little arrows, and that's because there are actually sidebars that are currently collapsed on the left and right. And we'll see in a moment that you can bring those out, and they'll contain various widgets for doing more things with the text. But fundamentally, we've just got this nice, clean reading environment for just focusing on the text itself. There's information about what it is that you're looking at, the text group and the work, and exactly what passage you're looking at, in this case, book 1, line 1 to book 1, line 7. Now, incidentally, if there are multiple parallel versions of a text, whether they be multiple editions in the same language or translations, you can add those side by side with this add parallel version. And I'll show you that in a few slides' time. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about these sidebars. So now I've actually expanded both of the sidebars, and each sidebar contains a series of widgets. And these widgets operate partly independently of one another. There's some interaction between them, but they're primarily about either letting you navigate around or getting additional information about what it is that you're reading or what you've selected in the text. So if you look on the left-hand side, this passage reference is where we can again see that we're currently looking at 1.1 to 1.7, but if you immediately wanted to jump to something, you could just type it here, either an individual line or a range of lines. You can type a passage here and it will take you to that. You can do searches directly from here within the work, and if there's any hierarchical structure to the document itself, in this case, there's an ancestors because we're looking at part of book 1. So if you wanted to navigate up to look at the whole of book 1, you could click on this one. When there's richer structure with multiple levels and so on, you'll sometimes get an ancestors and a children, and you can navigate around that way. Or as I said, you can type in a full passage reference here. Most of the widgets on the right-hand side are about either providing additional information about the text or controlling the way that it's displayed. So one of the things we see here is this CTS URN. I mentioned before, these CTS URNs are global unique identifiers for things like works or editions or even passages. In this case, this is the unique identifier for this particular passage in this particular edition. So in other words, book 1, lines 1 through 7 of this particular edition. And I'll say more about that in a moment. You can do things like control the text size, the text width. Each of these widgets is collapsible. So some of these are collapsed at the moment, some of these are expanded. One of the ones that's expanded is this morphology widget. When you click on a word, you can get the morphology, so you can get the lemma of it, what inflectional class it is, and what the actual morphosyntactic properties are. So in this case, the case, the number, and the gender of the word. You can also get a gloss of the word you've selected. If you haven't selected any words, it will give you glosses for all of the words in the passage that you're looking at. Although this word list is only available for Greek at the moment because that's the data that we have. And what this is, so this is giving us a gloss of meanness and also giving a measure of relative frequency. So in this work, meanness appears just under once per 10,000 words. And then another feature that I want to mention here, because it's important from an architectural point of view, is this CHS commentary, which actually just got renamed the New Alexandria commentary. So if you actually go to scaife.perseus.org now, it won't say CHS commentary, it'll say New Alexandria commentary. But this is actually a completely independent project from Scaife, done at the Center for Hellenic Studies at the moment, and they're putting together a commentary of a number of works, including Homer and the Odes of Pindar as well. But the really interesting thing that they've done is, as they've been putting together this commentary, they've made available the commentary via an API, via a call you can make on the web, where you give it a CTS URN for some passage, and it will return if there's any commentary about that passage. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So Scaife knows that you're looking at book 1, lines 1 through 7 of the Iliad, and that's indicated by this CTS URN. So what Scaife does is it makes a call out to the New Alexandria commentary saying, hey, do you have anything, any commentary about this CTS URN? And it comes back and says, yes, well, yes, I do, and here it is. And so this is a really nice way, and this from Scaife's side only took about half an hour to implement because of the wonderful work done on the New Alexandria commentary. We were able to take advantage of that. And it all comes down to the fact that both Scaife and the New Alexandria commentary are based around these CTS URNs, these identifiers for passages within works that lets us in multiple software systems be able to talk about what passage we're interested in. So I mentioned before that you can click on this add parallel version. So now we're looking at the Greek text of the start of the Iliad next to a English translation. Now, one of the challenges, and I mention this because we're starting to do a lot more work to make this a little better. In the case of things like poetry organized into lines, it's quite common in translations of poetry not to try to keep the line structure because it's just too difficult to have a meaningful translation that maintains the line structure. And so in the case of this particular English translation of the Iliad, there's no attempt to try to translate line 1 into one line and line 2 into another line and so on. And one downside to that is that there's not as, it's harder to synchronize what you're seeing on the left with what you're seeing in the right. And so if you actually do go to something like this, you go to the Iliad and you look at the Greek and the English side by side, as you scroll through it, you'll see that it doesn't always line up exactly because we don't have rich enough alignment going on between the two texts. Now that's actually a problem that's being solved, and I'll talk towards the end about that, and I'll actually show you a prototype of a side-by-side Greek-English view of the Iliad that actually keeps the sentences aligned, so you can much more easily see what's going on. But this is an example of a parallel reading that's possible. And as you paginate through this, as you go from one page to the next, the two will keep aligned. Sometimes, as I mentioned, because things don't necessarily match up exactly line by line, sometimes we have to do a little bit of work to try to give you as best we can the corresponding English for the Greek you've asked for. So if you said, for example, I just want to see the first line of the Iliad, I want to see 1.1. Now, there is no 1.1 in the English translation because all we know is that this whole initial section corresponds to the first 4 lines. And so we do the best we can. We always try to show you at least as much of the English translation as is covered by the Greek. But as I said, towards the end of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about better ways of solving that. By having better alignment, it really comes down to having better data about how the two texts are aligned.
James, sorry, one note about this last thing. You will talk again later about this problem. So if I understand for now, so in this situation, we can't align 2 CTS URNs for the Greek and the English.
Yes,
because we don't have a CTS URN for English.
Yeah, the English, we do have CTS URNs in the English, but they're at a much coarser granularity than the Greek.
Yes. Okay.
Right? That's
okay.
So I mention this because as you use the Scafe viewer, you'll sometimes come across these situations where you asked for a very narrow passage in Greek and you got a much bigger passage in the English, and it's just because the URNs weren't narrow enough for the CTS URNs in the English weren't as precise as the ones in the Greek.
Yes, I'm just noting this for our audience because that's the thing. So in this case, we talk a lot about alignment in general and also translation alignment. In this case, we don't have a translation alignment
exactly.
with the first thing. Exactly. This is for our audience. And on the other side, the problem is that we have CTS URNs for both, for the ancient Greek and for English, but the granularity of the CTS URN for the English is not enough for this alignment. So I'm repeating this.
Yes.
This is for the audience. We know that, but just to specify that this is a data citation problem or a problem concerning citation system. So
yes, but we'll see later on how translation alignment solves this, because this is something we are doing work on. But this is just to make sure people are aware of the limitations of what's currently available, and it will also give some motivation for what's coming up.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. So just to talk a little bit about this sort of pipeline of how new texts are getting into the Scaife reader in the Perseus Digital Library, mostly through the first 1K of Greek pipeline. And in many cases, they're coming about through OCR work of Bruce Robertson and his LACE tool. So out of copyright editions are scanned and OCR'd and corrected in the LACE tool. They're then marked up using TEI XML and Capitans compliant XML, which I'll come to in a moment and explain what that means. And then it's put into GitHub. And you can go to GitHub at the moment, the Perseus Digital Library or the first 1K of Greek GitHub repositories, and actually get to the TEI XML of any of the works that are available in Scaife. And in fact, the principal way of getting things into the Scaife viewer at the moment is to have them available in GitHub in a compliant directory layout that's dictated by the Capitans guidelines, and we just need to point to that repository and we can bring it in. Just what those guidelines are, I'll come to in a couple of slides. I just want to say a little bit more about these CTS URNs because it's such the heart of the way that we interoperate with a lot of different things. So the CTS URN, as you would have seen in the CTS URNs you've seen so far, they all start with URN CTS, and then what's called the CTS namespace, which for Greek literature is normally Greek lit. It can be other things, obviously, for other collections of literature. And then you have what's called the work identifier. And then finally, the passage reference. So it's a series of colon delimited fields, URN CTS, colon the CTS namespace, colon the work identifier, colon the passage reference. And the work identifier is further split up, delimited by dots into the text group, the work, and the edition or translation. And so a particular edition or translation of a particular work in a particular text group has a work identifier, and then that can be combined with a passage reference to directly address a particular passage in a way that is independent of Scaife, and so it can be used by lots of different systems. And as I mentioned, that's actually key to the way that Scaife and the New Alexandria commentary are actually able to interoperate. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because I know that there's been other talks about TEI XML and Epidoc and so on, but the current, this is no longer true of future stuff that we're doing with Scaife, but the current way that Scaife works is as a requirement that the documents be in TEI XML, and that TEI XML contains information, structural information about the text. It can contain additional markup as well, but also provide metadata And very importantly, is compliance with the Capitans guidelines. So Capitans is a suite of tools in Python for dealing with citable text. And you can read more about Capitans at capitans.org. But the key thing for Scaife is that in order for us to be able to display certain texts, you've got to have a certain directory structure with certain metadata files and a particular section in your TEI header called a references declaration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those. The directory structure is very simple, and you can see this if you go to the GitHub repositories for the Perseus Digital Library and the first 1K of Greek. There'll be a data directory, and then under that there'll be a directory for each text group. And then within that directory, there'll always be a _CTS__.xml that contains various bits of metadata, like the name of the text group. And then there'll also be a subdirectory for every work. Each subdirectory, each work subdirectory will also contain a CTS.xml file that, amongst other things, will give the name of the work. And then for each edition or translation, there'll be an XML file. So that's one of the requirements of Capitans, is that you have this directory structure. The other requirement is this thing in TEI called the references declaration. So I just want to briefly explain how that works. In a bunch of cases here, I've shown you these passage references like 1.1 to 1.7. And you may be wondering, how do we know, given an XML document, what 1.7 means? So, you know, if you've got the Iliad in XML and somebody says, I want 1.7. And in fact, that's exactly what Scaife does. It asks the Capitans suite, give me 1.7. The way that it's defined what 1.7 means for a specific document is through this bit of TEI called a references declaration. What we're wanting to do is basically somehow translate 1.7 into an XPath that navigates down the tree structure of the TEI document and says, I want to get, see there's this div type equals text part subtype book, n equals 1. The 1 in the 1.7 corresponds to the 1 in the n attribute here. And then within that, there's an L element with an n equals 7. And that's what we mean by the 7s, is line number 7 within book number 1. And so there's an XPath that defines that. There's a, you know, if you navigate down the element structure, TEI text body div, and then within that there's a div that has an n equals 1, and then somewhere within that you've got an L with an n equals 7. That's what we want to, that's what we want 1.7 to mean. And this refs decal in your TEI basically defines that. It says that if you ask for something that matches some string dot some string, this is how I'm going to map it to an XPath to retrieve that particular book and line. Or if you just ask for 1 or 2, this is how I map that to a particular XPath. And so this is, as well as the directory structure and the metadata files, these references declarations are an important part of getting a TEI XML text ready for display in the current Scaife viewer. And I've linked in the associated links for this seminar. I've included a link to the Capitans guidelines, so you can see in more detail exactly what you need to do this. Okay, so just to now move on to the architecture of the current Scaife viewer. There's a front-end web application that's written in a JavaScript framework called Vue.js, and that communicates with a back-end server that's written in Django. And that the way that Django is getting the texts to deliver to the front end is that it makes use of a part of the Capitans suite is a server called Nautilus, which understands CTS. And so texts in the GitHub repository are accessed by Nautilus, and via XSLT, they are transformed into a combination of HTML and Vue.js widgets that are then sent to the front end. That's sort of the basic way in which the basic path that things get from the GitHub repository to the front end web application. There's a couple of other things going on. We index all of the works in the GitHub repositories to Elasticsearch, and that's what's used for things like the text search that you saw. The library is driven by getting metadata information from Nautilus as well. And various calls can be made out to external services, either directly from the front end, like that's what happened with the New Alexandria commentary. The browser is just making a call out to the CHS server to get the commentary information. In other cases, it's actually the backend server, so the morphology information is coming from another external service, Morpheus. And so when you click on a word in the front end, it makes a call to the Scaife backend, which then makes a call out to the morphology service. Even at the indexing process, you saw when I showed you the text search, you can search by lemma. The way that we lemmatize the texts is we take an existing lemmatization of the Greek texts, and while we're indexing, we incorporate that information into the index that we put into Elasticsearch. And then the only thing I haven't mentioned here is PostgreSQL doesn't really play much of a role in Scaife at the moment. Its primary role is that there are couple of things that Scaife does support if you log in, and information about your user account is stored in Postgres. But all the text itself is made available via Nautilus and is stored on the file system retrieved from a GitHub repository. The widgets, those components that you saw on the left and right hand sidebar, they're written in this JavaScript framework called Vue.js. They can sometimes have internal state of their own, but they also share state with other parts of the reader. So sometimes, when you click on a word in the reading environment, that changes the global state of the reader, and various widgets like the morphology widget or the word list widget respond to that and change what information they're showing. And as mentioned, they can make calls to widgets can make calls to external services. And writing new widgets is one way to contribute to Scaife. If there's some external service that you'd like to integrate with, like what I did with the New Alexandria commentary, then that's just a matter of writing a new widget. And it's fairly straightforward to do so. You can look at other examples of how other widgets have been written. But now I want to move on to talking a little bit about Scaife moving beyond just the Perseus digital library, because one of the really exciting things that's happened in the last year is Scaife's adoption by other projects. The initial goal in terms of the funding from the Alexander von Humboldt Chair of Digital Humanities was to build the beginnings of a new reading environment for Perseus and the first one, Cave Greek, as part of the Open Greek and Latin project. But it was always envisaged that Scaife would be a larger ecosystem that would enable people to build reading environments for their own work, regardless of whether that work is in the Perseus Digital Library or not. And so some examples of ways in which that started to happen in the last year. The Digital Sira project at the Aga Khan University, funded by the Qatar National Library, is putting a series of early Islamic texts online. It's a new website that will be hosted by the Qatar National Library, but it's using Scaife software to do that. Brill publishers are starting to use Scaife for their scholarly editions. And so their reading environment is also based on Scaife. And one of the great things about all of this is that work that is being done for the Digital Sira project and for Brill publishers and so on, everyone benefits because of the open source nature of the code. the work that's being funded by Brill actually benefits everybody because the code is completely open source. There's another project that we recently started with Brill Publishers and Naturalis, which is the Natural History Museum in Holland. A project called the Making Sense Project to do with scanned 19th century manuscripts done by botanists and zoologists traveling in the colonies. There's the very top of the list, there's a project funded by the Mellon Foundation that Eldarion is doing with Johns Hopkins University and Tufts to really demonstrate interoperability between annotations that are produced independently but then consumed in the same reading environment, in this case Scaife, and that's funding a lot of the new stuff that I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, I just want to mention, because it's a really fascinating application of all this, there's a project at Harvard University, the brainchild of Ivy Livingston there, who's a Greek and Latin teacher. And this is the Hedera project, which is, I'll show you screenshots in a moment, but it has to do with identifying appropriate texts for language learners to read and providing the necessary, measuring the necessary vocabulary that a student will need to know to read a particular text. And that's again using Scaife technologies. So a lot of the stuff that we're working on to facilitate all this, I'll talk about a lot of these in a small amount of extra detail in the next few slides. But we've had to think more generally about different widgets and the way that they're what widgets appear on the page, because not all applications of Scaife need the same set of widgets. We also need to think more broadly about where the texts are coming from. They're not always in Capitans compliant TEI XML. For some projects, the texts are in other formats, and there's rich annotation information that might be available in a variety of different formats as well. There's things like images and audio that we want to support. And I'll show examples in a moment of the kinds of translation alignment that we want to be able to support as well as things like syntax trees. So here's just I'll give a series of sort of screenshots of various things we're doing. This is a prototype of the new Scafe Skeleton that we're working on, which is really just a system for picking what widgets you want. For certain projects, you have a fixed set of widgets, but for other projects, you may want users to control what widgets appear where, what widgets are on the left-hand side, what widgets are on the right-hand side, what appears in the middle, and so on. And so we've been prototyping this interface for letting users select what widgets they want where. And as the collection of available widgets grows, this will obviously be important for those sites that want to offer a lot of widgets, but a particular user may not want to use all the widgets at once. They may have different things that they're wanting to do at different times. Maybe they're in, a language learner might have very different widgets that they want versus somebody that's sort of doing very, very deep text critical work or something, or somebody that's wanting to study the manuscripts and so on, will have different requirements for what widgets appear. And so the skeleton is building out the capability in Scaife to give that sort of flexibility. So this is the beginnings of a better alignment, in this case, again, between the start of the Iliad in both Greek and English. Now, in this case, unlike the example I showed at the beginning that's in the current Perseus digital library, this translation has been aligned at the sentence level. And because we have the sentence level alignment, we're actually able to display and keep in sync, sentence by sentence, the Greek and the English. And so, this was, the alignment was actually done by Professor Gregory Crane himself. And we're able to take that alignment and make use of it in this parallel reader that lets you see the Greek and the English. This is just sentence level alignment, but the other thing that we're doing is where we have word level alignment, you can actually hover over individual words in one and see the corresponding word or words in the translation, or do the same, hover over an English word and see what the corresponding Greek word is, and so on. So that's another thing that will be possible in future iterations of Scaife. This isn't a classical text, this is a medieval text, but Beowulf, the big old English epic poem. I bring this up because there's a couple of interesting features that that we've implemented in this little prototype of a Beowulf reading environment. One that I won't play this for you, but we have audio synchronization for the part of the poem. So we have audio of somebody reciting the poem. We've synchronized that by time codes to the lines, and you can play the audio, and the individual lines will get highlighted as you listen to the audio. So again, that's something that's going to be possible with future versions of Scaife. Another thing that we can do with Beowulf, we have token level annotation of morphosyntactic information and a lemmatization, and also an English gloss. We can display that interlinearly, but the important point to make is there's this separation we're trying for between having the data and the particular way that we display the data. So if we have token level information, displaying it in an interlinear fashion is just one way of displaying it. Another way would be that you click on the word and you see it on the right hand side. But a third way is to visualize it in other ways. So you may want to, for example, say highlight in red all the verbs. So this is driven by the same information as the interlinear display. It's just displayed in a different way. And this is the header project at Harvard. In this case, we've this part of the tool has to do with evaluating whether a particular Latin text, how much of the particular Latin text is covered by the DCC Latin core vocabulary. So you can take texts and evaluate if a student knows a particular vocabulary list, how will they go with a particular text. But the other thing you can do is, as a student, you can track your familiarity with words. So you can rate particular words and say whether you know them or don't know them. That can be remembered by the system, and one of the things you can do with that is develop personalized gloss lists for a particular passage that only gloss those words that the system knows you do not know or you haven't seen before. So these are the kinds of things that, this looks quite different functionally from perhaps what you used to if you go to scaife.perseus.org, but a lot of the same technologies are underlying this. And we're trying to really take all of these various extra projects that we've worked on and bring them together in a general way for the next iteration of Scaife. So some of the things that we're doing to facilitate all of this, these new kinds of this new functionality in Scaife. Is first of all more decoupling between the Vue.js front end and the server. So we've been working a lot in the last few months on really a new way of thinking about the server, and doing a lot more of the aggregation, the bringing together of annotation data on the server side. I'll show a diagram in a moment that will probably explain that a little better. But when we get richer and richer annotation information, it makes it harder to stitch that together in the browser. It really makes it a lot easier to stitch it together on the server. That enables a bunch of, it's more efficient, but also it enables things like searches that are done on the result of stitching together the data. So if you have information about morphosyntactic information from one source, but you also have metrical information from another source, and you want to be able to do some search that involves both part of speech and metrical information, then in order to do that kind of searching, you need to have done the stitching together before the indexing happens. And that's the kind of thing that's going to be supported by the new server work that we're doing. And so the goal is to basically have a server that stitches together annotation and alignment information from a variety of different sources, and then exposes that via a query language called GraphQL that's then the Vue.js front end consumes. It'll still be possible for widgets in Scaife to directly make calls out to external services. But for the most part, we'll try to do the stitching together of disparate information on the server side. And for applications like Hedera and language learning and so on, also have this notion of personalized annotations, where some of the way that the texts are annotated is actually dependent on who you're logged in as. So if your information about what words you know and so on can be thought of as a type of annotation, they're very much thought of that way in Hedera. And so we, one of the things that our new server approach will support is that kind of personalized annotations. So we recently came up with the name Atlas for this new server approach that we're taking to Scaife. Atlas stands for Aligned Text and Linguistic Annotation Server. And the kinds of things that this server will be able to do, you'll be able to query for, is things like, get me all the tokens in the first 100 lines of the Iliad, with each one annotated with a part of speech and corpus frequency information. So under the covers, that may involve getting some text, getting some part of speech tagging information, getting frequency information from maybe a separate source, and stitching all those together and delivering those to the front end for display. There's other examples here, I won't read them all, but things like metrical information and audio, doing alignments, doing syntax trees. The last one here is something that we're working on with Johns Hopkins, is get me a AAAF manifest of a manuscript of the De La Rose, and also text tokens aligned to the images. So you can do a side-by-side viewing of a manuscript as well as a textual representation, and have those aligned together. So here's a picture to sort of explain some of that. The idea is that really what will happen is Capitans TEI XML will just be one of the ways you can get stuff into Atlas. It could be other XML, it could be CEX, it could be stuff from a graph database, or even a CSV file, things like W3C web annotations. And on the right, I listed a bunch of all the kinds of things that you might potentially provide to Atlas in these various formats. And then what Atlas does is it persists that information, it indexes it, and then makes it available via GraphQL to the Scaife viewer. So this will support all the stuff in the existing Scaife, but then all of the kind of more rich stuff that I showed towards the end in terms of much richer annotations and alignments and so on. And that's really the future direction that Scaife is going. So just to finish up, and I actually may just make it in the hour. If you're interested in contributing in any way to this, or if you have maybe you just want to contribute as a developer, but maybe you have a digital philology project that needs a reading environment, this is definitely how you can be part of the community and be part of the ecosystem. One of the real goals of the Scaife project has always been to reduce the need for individual projects to invent their own reading environment, and to be able to take advantage of what we've done with Scaife and focus more on the other scholarly aspects of the project that may be more different from project to project, and not have to sort of reinvent the wheel too much with regard to the pure reading environment. So the homepage of the software project itself is scaife-viewer.org. And that's really probably the only thing you really need to remember. There is a newsletter you can subscribe to just for sending out updates of what's going on. We've only sent one update. We just sent one yesterday, was the first update. So they're not frequent, but it's just a great way of, if you want to make sure that you don't miss out on what's going on in the Scaife world. There is a form for subscribing to the newsletter on the scaife-viewer.org webpage, but I've also put a link there if you're interested in subscribing to that. You can look at the source code under the Scaife Viewer organization on GitHub. We also just started a new Slack workspace. If you actually want to sort of chat to us more directly, and interact with the developers and other people that are working on stuff relating to Scaife, I certainly encourage you to join the new Slack workspace. It's the link for joining the Slack workspace is mentioned in the newsletter that just went out yesterday. So if you go to that buttondown.email link, or you subscribe to the newsletter on scafe-viewer.org, you'll actually see the newsletter that we just sent out yesterday, and that that has a link to join Slack. And I certainly encourage you to do that if you're interested. So I guess in a way, if you want to sort of more at a distance, just observe what's going on, I encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter. If you actually want to get more involved in conversation, you have questions, you have ideas for how to contribute, then I definitely encourage you to join the Slack workspace. That's all I have. When I was putting together these slides, I sort of realized after the second half of this presentation, it doesn't really make sense to just sort of use things like the Perseus Digital Library logo there and Perseus Digital Library here, because the whole point is that Scape Viewer is not just about the Perseus Digital Library. It's about whatever project you want to use the Scape Viewer for. So I really sort of view it as your project here, Scape Viewer and Atlas. So I certainly encourage you to get involved. And if you have any questions, actually probably Slack is the best way to do that. And I'll just end with these links again, just so everyone has a chance to get those. Although they're linked to from the GitHub wiki, and so you shouldn't have any problem finding those. Okay, Monica, that's it.
Well, thank you very much for this, well, really very detailed presentation, but very, very clear presentation of the Scaife viewer for our audience. Well, for the audience, as you can see, so Scaife, the Scaife viewer is a resource that can be used for scholarly purposes, but also for educational purposes. There are really many, many different things for classicists. Well, not only classicists, not only people interested in ancient Greek and Latin, but in general, scholars interested in historical languages. Also digital scholars, developers, sorry for using this label, computer scientists. So there are many, many different things covering different fields and different disciplines, I have to say. And one thing about your last slide, yes, Scaife is not only Perseus, and maybe this is also the spirit of Scaife in the sense that this his original idea. I remember I met Scaife now, yes, 10 years ago. I remember him and this idea of connecting resources. 10 years ago, technologies were different, and now is really good to see what we have here with the Scaife viewer. Well, I don't have to add other things. Thank you for showing future developments and this aspect about the alignment, where we can really see how aligning, in this case, different languages, and then I think we can apply that also to intra-language alignment when we have different editions of the same text, of course. Well, we have people on YouTube. I see as for now in this moment, before we had also other people, we have 4 people watching us. Remember, this is for our audience on YouTube, that you can also join the Hangout, and if you can't get the link, please join our mailing list for Synonykis. And this is also for students. I know that students sometimes they are shy, they don't want to be part of the Google Hangout, but this is an opportunity. The last thing, James will participate in the big Digital Humanities Conference in Utrecht next week. So, if you're interested, well, James, I'm sure that you will have many people asking questions about Scaife. I don't want to add other people, but anyway, we can. James will be in Utrecht next week, and you can also meet him in person and maybe
Yes.
have conversations.
Please
about
do.
Okay, great, excellent. Okay, so I think that's it, because this presentation was really, really complete, I think, so very, very clear, and there are many resources, as James showed. So that's it, James. I only ask you, not now, of course, but later, to also to add your slides to our
Yes, of course.
GitHub page. Thank you very much. Okay, so next week it will be our last session of Synoikisis for this semester, for this summer semester 2019. We will have a session about Coptic scriptorium with Carrie Schroeder. I will not share the session because I will be in Utrecht too, and so Valeria Vitale will chair the session with Carrie, and then you will get other information for next semester. So we already have a draft of the syllabus for the fall semester with Gabriel Bodar. Okay, so James, thank you very much for your time and for your wonderful presentation. And well, see you next week in Utrecht.
Yes.
Okay.
And hopefully I'll see some other people. As Monica
Yes.
said, please come up and say hi if you see me in Utrecht.
Yes. Okay. So now you have the time to study the presentation, and then you can have plenty of questions for James next week. Okay. And for our audience, so well, good late afternoon, good night. And so for me, see you next semester. And for Synoikis is still another session, the last one, the 15th session next week with Valeria Vitale and Carrie Schroeder. So bye and good night, and bye-bye, James. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao.